This episode is sponsored by Squarespace. Whether you need a domain, website, or online store, make your next move with Squarespace. I made a video a few years back that I know from the stats that a lot of you watched about how to make quality portraits with just an inexpensive Speedlight. And the idea of that was to prove that even if you couldn't afford the best and the fanciest gear out there, as long as you could control the ambient light in the space that you're shooting, you can still get great results with just a cheap Speedlight. But after I posted that video, some people said that they didn't really like that style, that the single light source just meant that the shadows on the opposite side of the face and the background and the clothes just tended to go too dark and too dramatic. Now, I love that style of lighting for my own portraits, but I understand that everything comes down to taste and everybody's different. So today, I want to show you a technique for taking control of your shadows, for bringing back the detail where you want them, and balancing the contrast of your highlights to your shadows. You might say to me, well, if I'm shooting with a single light source, can't I just use a reflector to push some light back into my shadows and fill them in a bit? And the answer is, yes, of course you can, but you don't have a lot of control. I mean, you could choose a white versus a silver reflector for how much light you wanted to bounce back in, and you could position that reflector closer or further away to make that bounce stronger or weaker to lift the shadows. But at the end of the day, I think there's a much better way to control exactly how much light and how much of those shadows you're filling back in. I've heard portrait photographers suggest that using the style of lighting I'm going to show you today gives your portraits that painterly look. And I'm not sure where this phrase came in, because some of my favorite portrait painters through the centuries are painters who used a very high contrast in their images and very deep shadows, that chiaroscuro look. Painters like Caravaggio and Rembrandt really inspired me, for example, in my own photography. But maybe the reason some photographers talk about this style of portraiture as painterly is because there were far more painters through history who wanted you to see every detail from shadows through to highlights. They painted like our human eye sees, riding that thin line between making sure that there's details throughout the tonal range with a high dynamic range, but also having nice fine contrast and detail. So I think because more painters through history made this choice to paint the way our human eye sees rather than the way our modern cameras see with their limited dynamic range, this idea of painterly portraits in photography has stuck. To me, the labeling of this style of lighting for portraits isn't really important to me, but I thought I'd mention it to you so that when you hear this phrase, painterly portraits from other photographers, that's probably what they mean. But whatever your choice of language or how much shadows you actually want in your portraits, whether you want those rich dark shadows or you'd like to lift them and see more of the detail in your shadows, today I'm going to show you a really easy technique so you can control exactly how much of those shadows you want to see in your work. And all it's going to take is a couple of inexpensive Speedlights. So let's hop into my studio. Okay, so we're in my little garage studio. We haven't got a lot of space in here, so what I've done is I've put up a backdrop behind Stasia, which is like a hand-painted backdrop. I got it from Gravity Backdrops. You don't need anything this fancy. You could even just use a white wall behind, or you could hang a sheet, and even use, if the sheet isn't hanging straight, use some of the folds in that sheet to add a bit of shape and texture if you want. So that background is behind Stasia. I haven't got it too close to her because I don't want any shadows falling directly on it. So there's a bit of space between subject and background. When it comes to the camera, I'm just using my Sony a7R IV, which is a full frame camera. And then because I'm in this really tight space and it's about to get even tighter, I'm shooting with the 35mm f1.4 lens, the G Master, and 35 isn't a traditional focal length for portraits, but it's a completely legitimate choice and helps us just to stay a little closer in this quite tight space. And then on the top here, I've just got this trigger. When I did this video last time, some people were confused about how the camera was actually talking to the Speedlights in terms of the lighting that I was actually using to get the shot. This is the godox set. So this is one of the godox triggers. It's the X Pro S for Sony. And I'm using godox Speedlights. So this will talk to these Speedlights, and I can change the actual power settings of each Speedlight from the trigger. But you could go with something super cheap that doesn't actually let you control the levels of those Speedlights, but it just sends out a signal from the camera to the Speedlight. And those are much more inexpensive and very, very easy to get a hold of. That just means you're going to have to stand up and manually change your lighting, which obviously isn't a problem because once it's dialed in, you won't really need to change it again. So the first things I'm going to do do are, I'm going to just dial in my key light. So I've got my light stand here. The speed light I have here, it's the Godox 685. So just a decent speed light worth of power, nothing fancy at all. They're pretty inexpensive. And this is going through a Lencata collapsible beauty dish with a white interior. It's got 2 layers of diffusion material and a little grid on the front. These really aren't that expensive. I'm going to put a link in the description to something similar that you can pick up online. And this is going to be our key light. So it's going to be fairly directional. I've got it coming from left-hand side and slightly above at 45 degrees, that very, very traditional Rembrandt look. And we'll start off where we left that last video. This is going to give that more dramatic look with those deeper shadows, and we'll use that as a base level to start to fill those shadows from. Just something to remind you when it comes to the lighting in this, and I know there was a little bit of confusion last time I did one of these videos. Some of you were saying, but I can see lots of lights in the room and the strobe, so surely all the lights are kind of mixing together. But the truth is at the moment that the lights you see, there's this one in the corner that's just helping with video, and there's one over here off camera just helping you see this actual set, otherwise we'd be in total darkness. But these lights are not powerful enough to be picked up by the exposure in the camera. So at the moment, I am shooting f1.4, I'm at ISO 100, and I'm at a shutter speed of 1/1250 of a second, so a very fast shutter speed. And just to warn you that your camera and trigger setup might not be able to do this. The only reason I can shoot that fast on the shutter speed without losing shutter sync and filling the frame with black is because this trigger and Speedlight setup support high-speed sync, so I can do that here. But if you want to test if these lights are actually affecting your shot, easiest way to do that is just to turn your trigger off. And then when you take the shot, it should be completely black on the back of the screen. That means that even though these lights are on, the settings in the camera are set in such a way that it's not sensitive enough to even capture any of the light that's going on that I'm using here for videos. All it's powerful enough to do is to capture the light that's coming out of this speed light. And at the moment, I've got this key light set at 1/4 power. All right, so that gives us our base level look, that kind of quite contrasty, quite dramatic look, like those older paintings, the kind of chiaroscuro school with the deep shadows in the side. So say you don't like that look, that's not what you're going for. You want to fill some of those shadows in and get a bit of control and bring back some of that shadow detail. This is where we're going to add a second speed light. Okay, so you can see I've added this second speed light behind me. The speed light I've actually got on here is a really small speed light, also from Godox. It's the little TT350, so it's not nearly as powerful as this one. And I've actually got it set to a much lower power. So this one behind me, whereas this one is 1/4 and a much more powerful speed light, I'm going to start this one off at 1/64 power, so way down. And it needs to be really low power and really soft to start with, because I'm going to slowly dial it up and see how much of this light I even want to affect the shot. You'll find some people actually, instead of putting a light behind them, will actually put a second light on the camera, either mounting it on top, or some people use a ring light in front that will sort of fill those shadows globally from the front just at very low power. Personally, I don't like that, because I find that that ring light or that speed light on the camera, you can pick up those sort of specular lights in the catch light. You get a very pinpoint hard catch light in the eyes, and the way that it fills it can kind of cast weird little shadows sometimes. So personally, I like a really soft fill from behind me. This is the way I choose to do it. I've got probably about a 120 centimeter, 150 centimeter maybe octabox behind me, which the speed light's going into, which softens this light right up and fills all around me. So it's a very, very soft front fill. Maybe you can't afford one of these or you don't have access to a big softbox. The easiest way to do it if you don't have that is to leave all the softboxes off the front. Just take that speed light behind, and instead of facing it this way, have a white wall behind you, back yourself up against the wall, turn the speed light towards the wall, set it to 24mm zoom, so it's going to fill the space, back the speed light up a bit, and then let it bounce back off the white wall behind you, and that will give you a beautiful kind of soft wraparound light from behind you, which will fill those shadows in from the front. So now I'm going to take a few shots, right? I know this power is set. The settings in my camera aren't going to change now. They are where they need to be. I'm going to start this light low, and I'm just going to slowly start to bring it up and fill those shadows in from the front and see where I like the balance between my key and this global fill, this second speed light behind me. So now that we've got those shots in the camera, let's take a look on the computer and see what we can see in terms of the difference and what happens when we actually bring up this fill light behind us. Okay, so let's take a look at the set of images that I've captured on this shoot, and I want to show you what actually happens to the image as you slowly start to add that soft front-on global fill with that second speed light. So let's start with this image, and we're going to use this as our base level because this is just the one light image, just one light coming in from camera left in that kind of Rembrandt position, lighting Stasia. And you can see that the shadows in the clothing are very deep, they're very rich, they're quite black, and the background itself is barely visible. It's just giving a little highlight at the back of her head, but otherwise it's almost completely black as well. This is a completely legitimate choice, and personally a way I like shooting a lot. But maybe you're saying to yourself, those shadows are too dark and too deep for what I want. I want to lift them slightly. So what I'm going to do is we're going to cycle through adding the second speed light, and we're going to do that in 2-stop increments. So this is adding a second speed light at 1/64th power. You can see that there's slightly more detail in the shadows, but it's still very dark and very moody. Those shadows are still quite rich. The lift that it's giving is maybe more on the front of the clothes, maybe a slight lift to the background, but it's just a very, very light way to bring tiny bit of shadow detail out from the image. The next image is at 1/16th power, right? So we've jumped up 2 stops on that second speed light. We can see much more detail in the clothes, in the shadows, on the hair, and we can see more of the background start to show itself as the light goes past the subject and lights the background a little as well. If we jump 2 more stops to 1/4 power, you can now see that those shadows on the face are lifting. We can see even more detail in the clothing, and the background is getting lighter still as we go. And as we jump 2 more stops to the last one, this is that speed light behind me, that second global fill speed light is at full power now. Remember, it's half the power of the other speed light, so it's still not matching the key light that we've got coming in from left. So it's not ruining the shape of the light, but it's filling those shadows quite a lot now. And this is sort of that look that people might describe as painterly. Again, you can argue with that if you want. And now you can decide, do you want that darker look? Do you want this lighter look where more of the shadows are present? Or do you want something in between? But adding that second speed light is going to give you an inexpensive way to control exactly how much of the shadows you want to appear in your shot while maintaining the direction of that key light that you set up to give the main kind of look of the image. I hope you found this video helpful, and I hope again it's proven to you, especially those of you starting out, that you don't need access to the fanciest lights out there. If you can get yourself just a couple of inexpensive speed lights, there's a lot you can do, and just those 2 little speed lights are going to be enough for you to teach yourself techniques in lighting and to work out what you want your style to be. But you might also find that while you're learning and trying out these techniques, that you're actually shooting portraits that you're really, really proud of, despite the fact that you're only using these cheap little lights. In fact, truth be told, I have quite a number of images in my professional portfolio, portraits that I'm still really, really proud of that were taken with cheap speed lights. After all, light is light. You don't need the fanciest gear. You just need to learn how to utilize and shape the light that you have access to make your portraits. If you'd like to see more of these little tutorials where I'm showing you how to make portraits with inexpensive gear, leave a comment down below. But in the meantime, I wish you the best of luck. Just before I go, I want to remind you about my Parable magazine, which are on sale now. I have 4 volumes available, and all of them feature photography and writing around a theme. They'll show you images that I've made in a particular genre or area in my life, and writing alongside of it to let you know how I made those images, and talking a little bit about life and what those images actually make me think of. Physical copies are available while stocks last, printed on beautiful uncoated matte paper at a big A4 size, or you could download the digital version, which features a PDF and an MP3 file of me reading the magazine to you. And lastly, thanks again to Squarespace for sponsoring this episode. If you need a new website or a domain, they're a fantastic option. I've used them myself as my website of choice for over a decade now. One of the things I really appreciate about using Squarespace is how easy their e-commerce functions are. When I first started my website, I knew one day I would want to have a store so I could sell my work in things like books or these recent Parable magazines or prints. But I was really intimidated about the whole process. But with Squarespace, it couldn't have been easier. Once I'd set up a Stripe account and integrated it into the store, it was easy to just load up images of my products, set a description and price, and then I could watch the orders coming in and see the statistics around that, make sure everybody got their orders with the correct addresses, and it even sent out automated emails to let customers know that their product was on the way. Start your free trial today at squarespace.com and go to squarespace.com/Sean Tucker to get 10% off your first purchase.